2. The mattress on the ceiling. Barnaby was discharged from hospital 3 days later and brought home to meet Henry and Melanie for the first time. "Your brother's a little different to the rest of us," Alistair told them over breakfast that morning, choosing his words carefully. "I'm sure it's only a temporary thing, but it's very upsetting. Just don't stare at him, all right? If he thinks he's getting a reaction, it'll only encourage his foolishness." The children looked at each other in surprise, unsure of what their father could possibly mean by this. "Does he have 2 heads?" asked Henry, reaching for the marmalade. He liked a bit of marmalade on his toast in the mornings, although not in the evenings. Then he preferred strawberry jam. "No, of course he doesn't have 2 heads, replied Alistair irritably. "Who on earth has 2 heads?" "A 2-headed sea monster," said Henry, who had recently been reading a book about a 2-headed sea monster named Orko, which had caused any amount of mayhem beneath the Indian Ocean. "I can assure you your brother is not a 2-headed sea monster," said Alistair. "Does he have a tail?" asked Melanie, gathering up the empty bowls and stacking them neatly in the dishwasher. The family dog, Captain W.E. Johns, a canine of indeterminate breed and parentage, looked up at the word tail and began to chase his own around the kitchen, spinning in circular direction until he fell over and lay on the floor panting happily, delighted with himself. "Why would a baby boy have a tail?" asked Alistair, sighing deeply. "Really, children, you have the most extraordinary imaginations. I don't know where you get them from. Neither your mother or I have any imagination at all, and we certainly didn't bring you up to have one." "I'd like to have a tail," said Henry thoughtfully. "I'd like to be a 2-headed sea monster," said Melanie. "Well, you don't," said Alistair, glaring at his son. "And you aren't," he said, pointing at his daughter. "So let's just get back to being normal human beings and make sure this place is spick and span, all right? We have a guest coming this morning, remember?" "But he's not a guest, surely," said Henry, frowning. "He's our little brother." Yes, of course," said Alistair, after only the briefest of pauses. It was little over an hour later when Eleanor pulled up outside in a taxi, holding a restless Barnaby in her arms. "You've got a lively one there," said the driver, as he turned the engine off. But Eleanor ignored the remark, as she disliked getting into conversations with strangers, particularly those who worked in the service industry. Her handbag fell into the gap between the 2 front seats, and as she reached for it, she let go of the baby for a moment, and he floated off her knees, drifted upwards, and bumped his head on the ceiling. "Oh!" gurgled Barnaby Brocket. "You ought to keep a hold of that lad," remarked the taxi driver, staring at him with world-weary eyes. "He'll get away from you if you're not careful." $30, was it?" asked Eleanor, handing across a 20 and a 10, as she realised that yes, he might if she wasn't careful. As she entered the house, the children ran to greet their mother, almost knocking her over in their excitement. "But he's so small," said Henry in surprise. In this regard, at least, Barnaby was perfectly normal. "He smells delicious," said Melanie, giving him a good sniff. "Like a mixture of ice cream and maple syrup. What's his name, anyway?" "Can we call him Jim Hawkins?" asked Henry, who had taken to classic adventure stories in a big way. "Or Peter the Goatherd?" asked Melanie, who always followed where her older brother led. "His name is Barnaby," said Alistair, coming over now and placing a kiss on his wife's cheek. "After your grandfather, and your grandfather's grandfather." "Can I hold him?" asked Melanie, reaching forward, her arms outstretched. "Not just now," said Eleanor. "Can I hold him?" asked Henry, whose arms reached further than his sister's, as he was 3 years older. "No one is holding Barnaby," snapped Eleanor. "No one except your father or me, for the time being anyway." "I'd rather not hold him just now if it's all the same to you," said Alistair, staring at his son as if he was something that escaped from a zoo and should be sent back there before he caused any damage to the soft furnishings. "Well, it's your responsibility too," snapped Eleanor. "Don't think I'm taking care of this baby?" suggested Melanie. "Yes, I suppose it's as good a word as any. Don't think I'm taking care of this baby all on my own, Alistair." "I'm happy to help, of course," said Alistair, looking away. "But you're his mother." "And you're his father." "He seems to have bonded with you, though. Look at him." Alistair and Eleanor looked down at Barnaby's face, and he smiled up at them, kicking his arms and legs in delight, but neither parent smiled back. Henry and Melanie looked at each other in surprise. They weren't used to their parents speaking in such a brusque fashion. They fished out the present they'd bought the previous day by pooling their pocket money. "It's for Barnaby," said Melanie, handing it across, "to welcome him to the family." In her hands she held a small gift-wrapped box, and Eleanor felt her heart soften a little at the welcome they were showing their little brother. She reached out to take the gift, but the moment she did so, Barnaby began to float upwards again, his blanket slipping away from him and falling to the floor as he drifted towards the ceiling, which was a much further distance to travel than the roof of the taxicab. It was also much harder on his head. "Oh!" grunted Barnaby Brocket, his tiny body stretched out flat as he looked down at his family, a decidedly grumpy expression on his face now. "Oh, Alistair!" cried Eleanor, throwing up her arms in despair. Henry and Melanie said nothing. They simply stared up with their mouths wide open and expressions of wonder on their faces. Captain W.E. Johns appeared, yawning, roused from sleep, and looked at the family that kept him fed, watered and imprisoned before following the direction of the children's gaze, until he saw Barnaby on the ceiling, at which point his tail began to wag fiercely and he began to bark. "Bark!" he barked. "Bark, bark, bark!" A little later, although not quite as soon as you might expect, Alistair climbed on a chair to retrieve his son, taking charge of him now as Eleanor had retired to bed with a mug of hot milk and a headache. Reluctantly, he gave Barnaby his bottle and changed his nappy, placing a new one under the baby's bottom just as Barnaby decided to go again, in a perfect golden arc in the air. Finally, he placed him in his basket, clipping the straps from Henry's rucksack across the top so he couldn't float up. At last, Barnaby went to sleep and probably dreamed of something very funny. "Melanie, keep an eye on your brother," said Alistair, positioning his daughter in the seat next to him. "Henry, come with me, please." Father and son crossed the garden to their neighbour's house and knocked on the front door. "What do you need, Brocket?" asked grumpy old Mr. Cody, picking a flake of tobacco from between his front teeth and flicking it to the ground between them. "The loan of your van," explained Alistair, "and its accompanying trailer. Just for an hour or two, that's all. And of course I'll compensate you for the gas." Permission granted, Alistair and Henry drove across the harbour bridge to the city and made their way to a department store on Market Street, where they purchased 3 large mattresses, each of which was designed for a double bed, a box of 12-inch nails and a hammer. Returning home, they dragged the mattresses into the living room, where Melanie was sitting exactly where they'd left her, staring at the sleeping baby brother. "How was he?" asked Alistair. "Any problems?" "No," said Melanie, shaking his head. "He's been asleep the whole time." "Good. We'll take him into the kitchen. There's a good girl. I have a job to do in here." He took 2 ladders from the garden shed and placed them at either end of the living room, then climbed one, holding the left-hand side of the mattress as he did so, while Henry climbed the other, holding the right. "Keep it steady now," said Alistair, as he took the first long nail from his breast pocket and used the hammer to pin the corner of the mattress to the ceiling. The nail went through easily enough, but met a bit of resistance in the floorboards of the upstairs room. Still, it didn't take too long until he got it right. "Now the other corner," he said, moving his ladder across and nailing the next part of the mattress in place. He continued doing this for almost an hour, using 24 nails in total, and by the time he had finished, the previous white ceiling had been covered over by the rather flowery design of a David Jones Bellissimo plush medium mattress. "What do you think?" asked Alistair, looking down at his son for approval. "It's unusual," replied Henry, considering it. "I'll give you that," agreed Alistair. By now the sound of all that hammering had woken Barnaby, and he was making a series of unintelligible gurgling sounds from his basket as Melanie tickled him under the chin and arms and generally made a nuisance of herself. Eleanor's headache had grown worse too, and she had come downstairs to find out what that infernal banging was about. When she saw what her husband had done to the living room ceiling, she stared at him, speechless for a moment, wondering if everyone in the house had gone quite mad. "What on earth?" she asked, struggling for words. But Alistair simply smiled at her and brought the basket into the centre of the living room, where he unclipped the rucksack cords to allow Barnaby to float upwards once again. This time, however, he didn't bang his head against the ceiling and say, "Ow!" Instead, he had a much softer landing and seemed perfectly content to be left up there, playing with his fingers and examining his toes. "It works," said Alistair in delight, turning to his wife, expecting her to be pleased by what he had done. But Eleanor, a perfectly normal woman, was aghast. "It looks ridiculous," she cried. "But it won't be for long," said Alistair. "Just until he settles down, that's all." "But what if he never settles down? We can't leave him up there forever." "Trust me, he'll get tired of all this floating business in due course," insisted Alistair, trying to be optimistic, despite the fact that he felt anything but. "Just wait, you'll see. But until then, we can't have him bumping his head every time he gets away from us. He'll damage his brain." Eleanor said nothing, just looked miserable. She lay down on the sofa and stared up at her son, stranded 11 feet above her, and wondered what she had ever done to deserve such a terrible misfortune. She was a perfectly normal woman after all. She wasn't the type to have a floating baby. In the meantime, Alistair and Henry went on about their business, installing the second mattress in the kitchen directly above the place where Barnaby's basket would be kept, and the third in his and Eleanor's bedroom for when he was asleep in his cot beside them at night. "All done," said Alistair, coming downstairs and finding Eleanor still lying on the sofa, while Melanie sat on the floor next to her, reading Heidi for the 17th time. "Where's Barnaby?" Melanie pointed her index finger upwards, but uttered not a word. Her eyes were pinned to the page. Peter the goatherd was speaking, and she wanted to hear his every syllable. That boy had wisdom beyond his years. "Oh yes," said Alistair, frowning, wondering what he should do next. "Do you think it's all right to leave him up there for the rest of the day?" Melanie continued to read until she reached the end of a long paragraph, and then picked up her bookmark. She placed it carefully between pages 104 and 105, and set the novel on the cushion beside Eleanor before looking directly at her father. "You're asking me whether she should leave Barnaby on the ceiling of our living room for the rest of the day?" she said coolly. "Yes, that's right," said Alistair, unable to look his daughter in the eye. "Barnaby," she repeated, "who is only a few days old? You want to know whether I think it is all right to just leave him stranded up there?" There was a long pause. "I don't care for your tone," said Alistair eventually, his voice quiet and filled with shame. "The answer is no. I do not think it is all right to leave him up there like that." "Well then," said Alistair, reaching for a chair in order to retrieve the boy, "perhaps you could have just said so." At that moment the doorbell rang. It was Mr. Cody from next door, looking for the keys to his ute, and having received no immediate answer, marching in to retrieve them without so much as a "by your leave." Alistair put Barnaby back in his basket, but forgot to tie the straps, and in a moment the boy was on the ceiling once again, resting comfortably against the mattress. Mr. Cody, who had lived a long time, fought in 2 world wars, shaken the hand of Roald Dahl, and seen many unusual things across 7 decades, some of which he had understood and some of which he hadn't, looked up and cocked his head to one side. He stroked his chin with one hand and ran his tongue slowly across his lips, firstly the upper lip and then the lower. Finally, shaking his head, he turned to Eleanor. "That's not normal, that," he said, at which point Eleanor burst into tears and fled upstairs to throw herself on her bed, determined not to open her eyes in case she had to see the awful monstrosity of the third mattress pinned above her. I'll send you some more in a few days.